Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and start our new unit, as what we're going to be doing next is going to be World War II. So what I need you to do is be certain that you get down the years of this, and also I call this the single most significant event in modern world history because World War II, just the scale of it, the size of it, is simply just enormous. The numbers, the casualties, the destruction, nothing compares to this. In fact, what we're going to see taking place in World War II is there are going to be multiple fronts on which multiple nations will be fighting at the same time. So nothing really changes the world like World War II does. Now, with that said, in order to get to the conflict itself, we need to take a look at the rise of the totalitarian dictatorships. Now, this is going to be taking place in the 1920s and mostly into the 1930s, as we're going to see European dictators take total control over their governments. Now, when I say totalitarian, what I mean is they are deemed to be the state, that all power is located in one person, and they are the entire government. Now, we're going to look at a couple of different government systems that are considered to be totalitarian, where they have all the government power. But the first type of totalitarian dictatorship we're going to talk about are going to be the fascist states. Now, eventually, we're going to get to all three of the fascist states, but for today, we're only going to be talking about one of them. Now, I do want to just emphasize this. There's another form of government that's going to be a totalitarian state that is not the fascists. Now, we're going to see it, as we've already talked about, this other totalitarian state in Russia and the Soviet Union. But I do want to just emphasize, communism and fascism are very different systems of government. First, as we talk about the fascists, they're stressing hyper-nationalism, where the state is above the individual, where really the individual has no protected rights. Your only real importance is just simply what you bring to the state, what you bring to the government. And if you're deemed to be unworthy, if you're deemed to be a subhuman, then you can simply be eliminated, as human rights are simply suppressed. They're in fact eliminated as what these fascists will call for the strength of the state. Now, one of these pieces of a fascist regime is going to be seen in military supremacy, in that they're going to finance and give the military almost their own kind of governmental powers. They're almost like a separate branch of government, and also what's called a police state, where police, and oftentimes are going to be branches of the military, have total power over the citizenry, and they have no rules regarding what they can or cannot do. They are an independent body that can do whatever they want as long as they continue to support the dictator. Now, under fascism, we're going to see some other characteristics as well. And I want to be certain again to highlight that the fascists and the communists are very different for multiple reasons. We'll get into the communists more a little bit later, but I do want to emphasize that in a fascist state, what they're centered around is the idea of eliminating unwanted races. Now, it depends on which fascist state you're in as to what they determine to be unwanted races. But for our example, we can talk about today, Germany is going to pick multiple different groups of people they deem to be unwanted races. But for the majority of it, it's going to be centered on the Jewish population of Germany and then much wider into Europe. Now, these unwanted races are deemed to be the weaknesses of the state, because under fascism and someone with total power, any shortcoming of the state, you would say, is obviously the dictator's fault. So you need to have what's called scapegoats. You need to have someone to blame any shortcoming of the state on. That's what these unwanted races are for. They are deemed to be unworthy to be within that state. They are deemed to be powerless. And once they're eliminated, the state will be more powerful and more united, according to the fascist system. Now, like I say, today, we're going to only get to one of these three fascist states. What we're going to be talking about today is what's going to be taking place in Germany in the 1920s and up into the 1930s. Now, we had talked about how after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was designed to punish Germany for multiple different reasons. the Allies deem that Germany should, in fact, be blamed for the start of the war. They have to accept the war guilt clause. They have to turn over their military to the Brits or destroy it themselves. They have their military shrunk down to 100,000 men. It's not even enough to defend Germany proper. But also, they're shackled with huge reparations, the $33 billion that they had to pay the Allied powers when the war is over. That huge amount of debt is going to cripple the German economy. Now, in order to try to pay off this amount of debt that Germany has required of them to be paid, there's really only one option they have. They owe $33 billion. Well, they have to get their hands on $33 billion, so the government just starts printing. So they print and print and print and print more of the German Deutschmark, or the German dollar. In printing all this money, what they do is devalue their own currency in an attempt to pay off the loan. Now you can see in this picture up here, there's a young woman who has just boxes and boxes of these dollars, because in order to buy anything, you need to have thousands upon millions of these Deutschmarks. Their economy is in shambles, and people start to look to some extreme ideas to potentially get them out of these problems. Now, we've kind of talked about before how in the 1920s, Europe is destroyed. They've just lived through the most horrific war the world had ever known up to that point. An entire generation of young men is dead because of World War I. And the people of Europe start thinking that our previous systems of government have failed us. If it was any kind of functioning government, they would have stopped this from happening. Maybe some of these extremist ideas are potentially very popular. Now, one of those extreme ideas is the idea of fascism. Now, a person that's going to glom on to this search for a savior is Adolf Hitler. Now, I have to again kind of remind you, because we talked about how in World War I, Adolf Hitler was in the trenches. He was fighting in the trenches for an extended period of time. When he gets out of the trenches and he is told of the Treaty of Versailles and how it's going to cripple Germany, he simply can't wrap his mind around it. He doesn't understand. Remember, there were no foreign troops in Germany when World War I came to an end, but Hitler and his fellow soldiers are told, well, the war's over and Germany lost. Again, it's hard for him to really understand this, so he starts concocting these ideas that more and more people find believable. They start saying, we must have been betrayed. We must have been stabbed in the back. We didn't lose the war. It was the politicians that lost the war. What Adolf Hitler is going to say when he gets out of the trenches and sees Germany crushed by the Treaty of Versailles is he says, I'm going to bring our country out of this abyss. I'm going to bring us back to glory. And he says, I'm going to make Germany an exemplary state. Now, when he says this, really he's just kind of preaching to a small number of followers. Early on in his political career, he's going to actually infiltrate a small political party that the German government has deemed to be potentially dangerous. When Adolf Hitler is actually hired by the German government to infiltrate this political party, he goes to one of their meetings, and in one of these meetings, there's a couple dozen people, and each of them have their opportunity to speak and kind of share their own thoughts. And the more this political party is speaking, the more that Adolf Hitler starts to think, this party is actually right. He starts to agree with what they're saying. Now, this is going to be known as the German Workers' Party. When Adolf Hitler is supposed to be infiltrating this political party, he's actually going to join the political party and become its de facto leader. Now, he becomes the leader for really a handful of reasons. One, he's simply just charismatic. He's a presenter. He's a public speaker. And the more and more he speaks, the more and more people start to join. As they say, he's almost hypnotic, the way that he speaks and the way he talks about German pride and bringing the German people back to the sun. Now, when he's speaking about these things, a lot of it is almost incoherent rambling with no real basis in fact. But the way that he's saying it, the more people believe him. The more they
the more they say that, yes, the Treaty of Versailles is shackling Germany and they must throw this off. He gets to be so popular that more and more people are joining the German Workers' Party, and Adolf Hitler believes that it's time to try to overthrow the current German government. So he and his followers are going to stockpile a very limited amount of weapons, and they're going to gather in a German bar, what they call the Beer Hall Putsch, where they rise out of this bar and take to the streets. Now, these are armed civilians in the streets of Munich, and they're encountered by the police. When the police encounter this small number of civilians, they give them an option. You either throw down your weapons, or we're going to open fire. Well, Adolf Hitler has kind of a famous line where he says, "We are the new German Workers' Party. You will eventually be working for us one day when we take power of this government. Join us now." It's at that point where the police open fire into this small number of followers and kill 16 of Adolf Hitler's followers. Now, Adolf Hitler is not hurt in this firing into the crowd, and this almost kind of intensifies his thoughts that he might be, in fact, a really messianic figure, that perhaps he is chosen by God for something greater. Now, when it's all over, Adolf Hitler is arrested. He's put on trial, and he's sentenced to 5 years for attempting to overthrow the government. Now, 5 years for attempting to overthrow the government, it's possible that maybe within those 5 years in a German prison that Adolf Hitler might have learned a lesson. Maybe he would have calmed his rhetoric and his fiery reasonings. But in fact, he's only going to serve 9 months. He's imprisoned in Germany for attempting to overthrow the government, and he serves 9 months in prison. Now, within those 9 months, Adolf Hitler is going to put down on paper his thoughts. He's going to write his own book while he's in prison. And his book, if you read it, it's very much unorganized. It's the ramblings of a madman. But as you read it, in hindsight, what you can see is actually Hitler is preparing for what he's going to do in the future. And it's almost kind of eerie as you read through it to see what his plans are, because what his plans are going to actually come to fruition. When he's in prison, he's going to pen his book entitled Mein Kampf, or My Struggles. Now, this is setting up his plan for Nazism, what will be his fascist government. Now, like I say, you read through it, and there's not really a lot of organization to it. It's not necessarily divided into chapters with each an organizing thought. It's really just ramblings. But as you read through and you have hindsight on your side, you can see that what he's saying in this book is what actually happens. So we're going to talk about 3 big things within this book that Hitler is going to say that will actually happen. The first one we're going to talk about is what Adolf Hitler says is uniting all the German-speaking people of the world into what he calls the Third Reich, or the Third Great German Empire. Now, what he points to is actually historically fairly accurate in that there were 2 great German empires before his time. He refers to one that was centuries before his time. The second one, he's really referring to Germany up to World War I. And the Third Great Empire is going to be during his time. Now, when he says unite all the German speakers, he's really pointing to the map of Europe. And Europe has been divided up into these artificial nations by the Treaty of Versailles. If you'll remember, when World War I comes to an end, there are 9 new nations created as buffer states between Germany and the Soviet Union and Russia. What a good chunk of this land is going to be is taken from Germany and from German-speaking nations. Adolf Hitler says, I'm going to erase those artificial barriers and reunite all these Germans into a greater Germany. Now, I'm running out of time here, so let me just tell you, we're going to pick up with this one in lecture number 2. So just when we're finished here, just be certain that you watch lecture number 2 as well.